US President Donald Trump signs a massive defense spending bill and greenlights more money to counter China and Russia. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. President Trump traveled to a US Army base on Monday to formally approve next year's $716 billion defense budget.
The National Defense Authorization Act is the most significant investment in our military and our warfighters in modern history, and I am very proud to be a big part of it. After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before, ever.
So in addition to funding the Pentagon and more military personnel, there's money for new equipment, everything from tanks to fighter jets to submarines, warships, missile defense and nuclear weapons program. But the legislation also seeks to counter a range of Chinese government policies. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get to our panel. Joining us from Providence, Rhode Island is Vladimir Golstein. He is a professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Welcome. With us from Philadelphia is Michael Johns. He's a former speechwriter for US President George H.W. Bush and the co-founder of the National Tea Party movement. Qinduo Xu is a fellow at the Pangoal Institution and a friend of this program, a policy center, of course, in Beijing. And joining us here in Washington is the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News, Simon Marks. Guys, thanks so much for joining us. Simon, I just want to start off by saying this $716 billion is not a small amount of money, is it? I mean, it dwarfs other countries' defense budgets by a lot.
Yeah, it's not chump change, there's no question about it. And you heard President Trump there insisting that this is going to rebuild the American military and reverse years, he argues, of atrophy on the part of the Pentagon. It's giving the Pentagon all sorts of new gear, all sorts of new kit, including some things that even the Pentagon never actually asked for when this was being put together by James Mattis in conjunction with what I suppose one could think of as the remaining sensible Republicans up on Capitol Hill. And the size of it, of course, is directly related to the fact that everybody up in Congress go to them and say, on the Republican side at least, do you want to spend more money on the military? Republicans and many Democrats will view that question as though you were asking them if they wanted blue skies and apple pie. Of course they do.
Thanks, Simon. Michael Johns, I want to bring you in here because obviously US President Trump always touts his own policies, but let's face it, as Simon kind of basically said there, US defense spending has been pretty robust, even under the Obama administration, at least the second four-year term. What's going on here? Is this making America great again, or is this pump priming the economy through big fat defense contracts?
Yeah, I think one of the premises that certainly came out during the campaign was the fact that you can't make America great again without making American defense great again. And while it's true that a lot of money was spent on defense during the Obama administration, there was really an erosion of American readiness. And this was reflected in our military preparedness, and also I think an unwillingness to really adjust to the growing geostrategic threat presented by Moscow and Beijing, which I think we're hopeful on the diplomatic front can improve, but until such time as it does, I think President Trump is doing the right thing and really addressing it in a robust and aggressive way, as he's done. And I think the essence of the quote that he used yesterday was the fact that the U.S. will always be a peaceful nation, but we in fact also will be prepared to fight and prevail in conflict if necessary. And that's ultimately the lesson that came out of the Cold War, is that the U.S. is supporting peace through strength, and that the best way to maintain that peace is to ensure that our military is prepared to fight and win conflicts anywhere at any time if necessary, even though we obviously hope that those never develop.
Well, Michael, I'll let other guests push back on that in a minute, but first of all, let's just say that the US defense spending plan for 2019 focuses more on what the White House, as you sort of suggested, their great power competition, aiming specifically at China and Russia. Let's just see what's in it. At the rim of the Pacific exercises this year, the largest multilateral naval exercises in the world, Chinese ships were conspicuously absent. After two successful previous appearances, China was disinvited by the US over its activities in the South China Sea. And under the 2019 Defense Authorization Act, China would be officially banned from those exercises. And there are other measures too. Plans for strengthening the US-Taiwan military relationship will be drawn up. An annual report on China's so-called malign activities in the South China Sea, a ban on the use by the US military of equipment made by Chinese firms Huawei and ZTE, an overhaul of investment rules on national security grounds, and cutting the budget for Chinese learning at US universities that house China's state-backed Confucius Institutes.
So this is broad-based, the suspicion of China and this sense of a threat from China, and to me that's a remarkable thing about this bill.
The US focus on China as a competitor comes as the US armed forces are downgrading the fight against terrorism and focusing more on the Asia-Pacific. The US Defense Secretary recently visited his counterparts in China and stressed the need for cooperation, but not before criticizing Chinese actions at a key regional security conference. This US Defense Act also provides more money to forge closer defense relationships with other nations like India and Sri Lanka. This year saw the first visit of a US aircraft carrier to Vietnam since the end of the Vietnam War. All over the Indo-Pacific, as the US now labels the region, the US is increasing its already overwhelming superiority.
What strikes me about this bill is, as you said, the diversity of provisions that deal with China and the scope. It's not simply authorizing more planes and ships to be built, which it does, but it also directs reporting requirements on issues like influence operations and espionage.
And China is not alone. Russia, too, is targeted in this spending bill, with plans for a permanent US presence in neighboring Poland, and NATO ally Turkey will be denied access to the new F-35 fighter jet, at least for now. Yeah, so that's basically what is in the new defense appropriations bill when it comes to other countries, especially China. Qinduo Xu in Beijing, what do you make of this new Defense Act? Of course, it follows on from a change in strategy from the Trump administration, which labels China and Russia competitors.
Well, obviously, this is part of the continuation of this national defense strategy developed at the end of last year, which views China and Russia as mostly the rival, strategic competitor instead of a cooperator on international issues. But, this is not surprising, personally. Of course, people would see that as the most very significant development in terms of the number, right? 716 billion US dollars. That's more than the next 7 countries' total defense budget, combined. Yes. So, the US has been in a predominant position in the world for decades, but it continues to be so. They want to maintain the predominant position, military at least, on this earth, even in the outer space. So no countries can stop the United States from doing that. But I think somehow like China and Russia, in particular China, is being used as a good excuse for the US to spend more money on the military. But then again, this is the choice of the United States. So it's really, of course, they see that China as competition, as competitor competing with the US. But if you look at China, it's mostly about its own territorial integrity and sovereignty. China is not challenging the US in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Caribbean Sea or in Latin America. No, it's not the case.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That is a talking point we've heard out of Beijing quite a lot in terms of the Caribbean. Vladimir, I want to put it to you. Obviously, Russia's mentioned this in this act as well, has been in the new defense strategy. I thought that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump were trying to rebuild a relationship, hitting the reset button again. Is this going to drive Moscow perhaps potentially closer to Beijing?
Yeah, it definitely will, because, first of all, Russia, of course, trying to establish good relationship with President Trump and hope that that establishment will be translated into diplomacy. But they are very well aware that there are other players on the United States scene, including Pentagon and including, sort of other, military-industrial complex. So I think Russians more or less sense it. They know that that's going on, build up in Eastern Europe, pushing NATO bases into their noses, so they're aware of that. They want to kind of to diffuse the situation, but I think they're preparing for that. And what we hear in all this, Pentagon attempts is sort of a desire to maintain its hegemony, a desire to control, these countries like China and Russia right there at their backyards. And of course, it's not quite realistic. What will happen, it looks like a real provocation. So there's both China and Russia will try to answer in kind. Then the United States would use it as a pretext, saying, these countries are flexing our muscle, we have to flex our muscle. So it's not quite rational, in my view.
Simon, is this a case of be careful what you wish for? That if you do spend this much on defense, you are sort of adding to tensions, creating potentially a global arms race?
I think it's a case of being very careful about defining this as a coherent policy that has the uniform support of the Trump administration. When we all know, right, and we've said this, you reported it there, we've discussed it, we all know that this is a defense authorization that is slightly taking resources away from the battle against terrorism and diverting them towards allowing the United States to be a counterbalance to Russian and Chinese influence on the world stage. That is orthodoxy as defined primarily by Jim Mattis, the last restraining influence on President Donald Trump. We have no idea if Donald Trump has any understanding that that is what is actually contained in this authorization. In the speech that he made there in New York 24 hours ago, he didn't once use the word terrorism, he didn't once use the word Russia, and he made only one glancing reference at China when he was discussing his proposal for the Space Corps that he wants to see put together, the Space Force that he wants to see put together. So we actually have no idea if he truly understands what's in this, and when he learns what's in this, and when he has Vladimir Putin on the telephone saying, what do you mean you want to base a permanent brigade in Poland, whether Donald Trump is not going to hit Twitter and say, hang on a second, what's all this about the direction of defense policy in the United States? It's
a complicated bill. I mean, I've been reading it for a few days, and there's a lot in it. But I think your point about Mattis is an interesting one. I want to speak to Michael Johns, because could it be that this increase in spending and China and Russia is just an excuse maybe to pump prime the defense of the military-industrial complex, as it's been labeled by former US presidents? That's something that the Chinese Ministry of Defense said. And they've also said this. I want to read out the reaction to this. The content of this law is filled with Cold War thinking, exaggerates the level of China-US confrontation, interferes in China's internal affairs, violates the One China principle and 3 China-US communiques, undermines the atmosphere of development of China-US military ties, and damages China-US mutual trust and cooperation. That is a long laundry list of complaints, Michael Johns.
Right. Well, a few things there. Number one is, as it relates to the so-called military-industrial complex, it's encouraging, I think, that General Mattis has listed as one of the 3 objectives of U.S. defense policy to restructure the way the Pentagon does business and to make sure it's done in a competitive way, and to erode and get rid of some of the waste that's been frivolously tossed at defense projects over the last few decades. Secondly, let me just take issue, I think, with the issues that have been mentioned so far. In many respects, this also is a reactive, not a proactive defense bill, in the sense that China's hugely aggressive and illegal efforts in the South China Sea, Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea, its efforts in eastern Ukraine and Georgia to some extent, these are real developments to which the U.S. is obligated to respond. And I think there's a great hope that those tensions can be eased in our mutual relationships with Moscow and with Beijing. Maybe a good chance that that could happen. But until such time as it does, the U.S. has an absolute obligation. In fact, it is a constitutional obligation to provide for the common defense of this country. And this budget and this president are committed to those ends.
Thanks. Qinduo, obviously you want to respond to that.
Well, of course, I understand the statement from the Chinese Defense Ministry. They obviously refer to the part of Taiwan. The U.S. strengthening its support to Taiwan, even militarily. And this legislation and also previous one, like a Taiwan Travel Act, basically to increase the level of interaction among the senior officials between the two sides. This is, from the Chinese point of view, a violation of the spirit, at least, if not the principle, between China, between Beijing and Washington. That is, you have to understand that the cornerstone of this very important bilateral relationship is like one China principle. Of course, it's kind of vague because for Beijing, one China refers to basically the China, People's Republic of China. But for Washington, it keeps like kind of vague. It's one China principle, but we don't specify which China. But anyway, there's one China. Yes. So you have to adhere to the fundamental principle for this stability and peace of relationship between China and Washington.
Are you worried that that might be changing behind the scenes a little bit with the Trump administration? The one China policy?
Yes, obviously, with right before he took office, he make a phone call with the leader of Taiwan. That's like very shocking to the people. China watchers inside the U.S. and of course the Chinese side. But gradually, later on, it seems the president understands how significant the moves could be, significantly bad, I would say. And this is, for China, this is about sovereignty and territorial integrity. There's no way, it's not like trade, you can negotiate. But this part is very difficult. So, yes. People would understand, people would criticize China for being aggressive. But look, a few years back, under the leadership of Ma Ying-jeou, there was peace, stability, and frequent exchanges and prosperity across the Taiwan Strait. What happened with this, taking office of Tsai Ing-wen? You have to find out the reason and the fundamental problem with the Taiwan leadership right now.
Thanks very much, Qinduo. Vladimir, obviously for every action there is a reaction. What do you think is the Russian reaction going to be to this defense bill? Of course, there's new sanctions being imposed on Moscow in the coming weeks, and maybe even more in November. Helsinki was meant to hit the reset button, but this defense act puts Moscow in the crosshairs.
Well, Moscow, of course, watches this very closely because, as you're aware, and your guest mentioned it, that there is brigades now in Poland and Estonia. Just last week, there was NATO plane, Spanish NATO plane in Estonia shot accidentally a missile, which landed about 100 miles from Russian border. So Russians are very much concerned about that. But I think, and they are sort of definitely will be prepared. But what I want to say, that going back to about 20 years ago, U.S. had a total dominance, and other countries had to play along. But reality now is both Russia and China are new kids on the block, and they are sort of growing, and that's the reality. And they both are fighting for so-called multipolar world, where diplomacy reigns, where there's different sort of centers of strength, and where people sit together and negotiate and take each country's interest. Just to say that United States to go around the world and tell what people in Crimea how they should vote, or how Ossetia and Georgia have to settle their questions. Yeah. It's was possible 20 years ago, 10 years ago, but it's not realistic. So the United States has to be forward-looking, and China is going to be there, Russia is going to be there. These are very giant, powerful countries, and I think the doctrines have to kind of accommodate that rather than try to push this genie back into the bottle. It wouldn't go.
Okay, thank you. Simon, you were based in Moscow during the Cold War. Is this Cold War 2.0?
Well, it depends who's running American foreign and defense policy. And that goes to the heart of this conversation. We're talking here about the United States. We're talking here about doctrines, as though there is a single coherent strategy here. There is no single coherent strategy here. It was the State Department that made the formal finding that the Russians had used the nerve agent Novichok on the streets of Britain, that kicked off the new set of sanctions and theoretically will lead to more sanctions
the White House was being enforced to do that. They had to, yeah.
The White House has said nothing about it publicly whatsoever. We have no idea where Donald Trump stands on that particular issue, and we have no real idea where Donald Trump stands on the details of what is in this authorization details that he will learn as they become apparent over the months ahead. And, you know, the capacity for him to, as he did with that telephone conversation with Taiwan very, very early on in the transition period. Yeah. I mean, the capacity that he has to blow this whole thing up is enormous.
I don't want to obviously talk about blowing things up. We're talking about military strategy. Qinduo, I want to move on a little bit and talk about Space Force, because obviously this has been a big rollout over the last couple of weeks, although Congress and actually the military in the US are not that enthusiastic about it. But the Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump of the US, is. Let's just take a listen to his rollout.
We're also making an unprecedented commitment to developing our artificial intelligence capabilities. In order to maintain America's military supremacy, we must always be on the cutting edge. That is why we are also proudly reasserting America's legacy of leadership in space. Our foreign competitors and adversaries have already begun weaponizing space, developing new technologies to disrupt vital communications.
Yeah, well, he didn't say Beijing there, but we kind of worked out where he was aiming, accusing essentially Beijing of weaponizing space first. What's going on here?
Well, I think, you know, the concern is, you know, whether there was a new trend of a militarization of this outer space, whether there will be arms race in the space, kind of a space war. So that's the concern, you know, between Russia, China, United States, and India, increasingly also European countries. So that's not something people would like to see. Now the U.S. obviously is ready to take the first step, basically to sort of like, you know, militarize the outer space to maintain the U.S. leadership, or using his words like a supremacy. Yes, there's U.S. supremacy, there's the U.S. You know, supreme military power, technology. But then, you know, ironically, it talked about leadership. You know, we are seeing less and less leadership, either in this planet or outer space over there. So that's the problem probably with this administration now.
Michael Johns, Space Force. US President Trump also said that the US must dominate space. Is this a new space race, and how is this going to materialize?
Well, I mean, again, this is a reactive response, not a proactive response. The reality is both Moscow and Beijing have been very active in space and militarizing space in ways that are potentially and even imminently threatening to U.S. strategic interests and the world's strategic interests, for that matter. So to not address
I just want to jump in. Can I just jump in for a second? Because I remember a President, Ronald Reagan, who launched something called SDI, I think it was Strategic Defense Initiative, which was essentially Star Wars.
Correct.
And that could shoot down missiles, but also essentially be offensive.
A defense system.
And that was a huge problem for Moscow for years and years and years. So this is going back to the 1980s. Isn't it that the US started weaponizing space before people like Beijing really actually have much presence?
Yeah, in a sense, SDI, again, was a defensive system. There was no ability that when Reagan rolled out SDI for it to have an offensive capability. It was designed to protect the world from a possible launch of, at that time, Soviet long-range or other missiles. So it made sense from a U.S. strategic standpoint. Now we have, I think, as Russia, if you look through it, you really had, at the end of the Cold War, a degree of optimism in the U.S. that we're going to have relieved tensions with major powers of the world. 9/11 put the U.S. focus predominantly on the real imminent threat of terrorism, which President Trump's made great progress with. Unfortunately, Russia and China continue to be major threats, not just to the United States, but to our allies and to free nations around the world.
Simon, you wanted to add something?
Well, just that this conversation about the militarization of space, this is not serious. Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, last year publicly said he wanted nothing to do with it. Okay, he's lost the argument with his own president, but I don't know anybody in this town that genuinely thinks that this is going to advance in any meaningful fashion while Mattis is running things at the Pentagon.
Vladimir, obviously Russia pioneers in space. How do they respect this?
Well, I think, President Trump is correct that, he has to think about defending the United States. So if, Russia and China are, making some progress, he has to sort of, push this church in this direction. Everybody understands position of United States. It has to, to defend itself. But, of course, it can skyrocket out of control. And that's what they worry. If United States start developing, crazy weapons, of course, Russia and China will start, responding in kind. So I think, that's, there is nothing wrong in having, beefed up military. There's nothing wrong to do good research in space. We know that Russians are pretty good at that. So, but I think it's, better have, negotiations as well, and diplomacy as well. But if you can push scientists to discover new ways of communicating, flying, or discovering, new stars, there's nothing wrong with it.
Qinduo?
Well, like when the U.S. says, China or Russia is a threat to U.S. supremacy, but the U.S. is pursuing actually an absolute concept, absolute security. That is like, I can shoot your satellite, but you should not have the ability to shoot mine. So we cannot be on equal footing. Otherwise, I feel threatened. So you are a threat to me. This is, like ideology of hegemony. Basically, I'm the only one to have the technology. I'm the only one who is the most powerful. Why should be the U.S. the only one? And China and Russia would develop their own technology, would protect their own, national interests in whatever legal way they would take. But this is the U.S. way, yes. But there's a danger. At the same time, you cannot say I'm leading the nation. I'm, demonstrating leadership by developing new military technology or new, say, weaponization of the space. This is not leadership.
Simon, final word, last 30 seconds. Obviously, we haven't talked about arms control, but these sort of budgets don't really sort of lend themselves to potentially working out new, for example, nuclear agreements between Moscow and Washington anytime soon, which of course has to happen.
Well, but it has to be political will, right? I mean, budgets, money can be spent on arms control negotiations after governments have decided they want to engage in good faith arms control negotiations. And that comes back to the fundamental question you've got, which is, what is the deal between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? How is Donald Trump going to forge a relationship with Xi Jinping in China that is productive, that takes people down these various traditional diplomatic roads? We're nowhere, certainly, on the former.
So we shall see, as the US president is very fond of saying. That's it. Thanks so much to our panel. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But of course, the conversation always continues online. Join us at CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us. See you soon.